In his 1993 essay, Contingency for Beginners, psychoanalyst Adam Phillips devotes a short section to the writer Marcel Proust as the writer on contingency par excellence. Phillips compares Proust, identified in his argument with the narrator of À la recherche du temps perdu, fairly directly, to Freud, this follows on very nicely from what we were talking about, whose study of errors and accidents, the psychopathology of everyday life, reconceives both errors and accidents as always meaningful, and so no longer completely accidental. Every accident is in fact intentional according to the logic of the unconscious, suppressed psychical material, in Freud's phrase, demanding recognition. Proust, as Phillips suggests, is similarly open to the possibility of learning about ourselves through chance encounters with our own past. These experiences for Proust are not, however, a matter of the past inside us, busily and furtively arranging for its own disclosure. They require a certain encounter with the world, with a material object, which we cannot seek out, and may or may not be lucky enough to stumble upon. Early in the first volume of his novel, Proust reflects on the encounter with the famous Madeleine biscuit that wins back the foundational experience of pure time upon which the book rests. He puts such moments into a contingent relation, as Phillips notes, with another chance event. There is a great deal of chance in all this, and a second sort of chance, that of our death, often does not let us wait very long for the favours of the first. A self that lives its contingency without contesting it, as Phillips puts it, must also have a more direct apprehension of its own death, and the way in which this death resists any attempt at prediction, evasion, or control. It is that self, Phillips writes, that has no contracts to make, and that is linked with one's death in a way that the self of the unconscious desire can never be. The idea that this self entails the belated recovery or processing of the earliest forms of experience seems to chime, although Phillips does not articulate this, with the opening pages of Proust's novel, the memories there of oneself as a child emerging from sleep, and the intense attachment to the mother, which is identified strongly with this barely formed self. This Phillips account is a seductive account of Proust, one that suggests a model for psychic wellness, a selfhood that can adjust to emotional disappointment and accept shattering loss, and accept in a very, very open way its own mortality. Malcolm Bowie, great Proust scholar, seems broadly to agree with this account in his guide to the novel, Proust Among the Stars, suggesting that for Proust, death is a fact to be acknowledged rather than a problem to be solved. Bowie indeed saw the whole work as bookended by scenes of death, in identifying the sleep of the earliest pages as a kind of oblivion, source of a deeper and more elusive terror than waking experience or thought, in which the child is desiring darkness but recoiling from it too, a consciousness feeding on the thought of its own extinction. Bowie sees a gulf open, however, over the course of the novel between the narrated child and the narrating adult. The idea of a self that has no contracts to make indeed seems strongly at odds, I think, with the subject we find in the pages of Proust's novel. For the bulk of the novel, the narrator is far from the radically undefended self to which he returns when bodily memories overcome him, and the boredom of living, in Samuel Beckett's characteristically negative construction of the narrative, gives way to the suffering of being. Over the course of countless pages, in the narrator's dealings with Albertine and even his beloved grandmother, whom he at different moments wants to push towards death and to pull back into life, we encounter a self which contests, albeit invariably self-defeating ways, the separateness of the other and its capacity to desert, whether this desertion is through betrayal, emotional indifference, or death. The final volume of Proust's novel offers two parallel sets of revelations that are arguably at odds with one another and crystallize this tension between Proust's narrator's embrace of chance in his artistic design and philosophical outlook, and his resistance to what he sees as the arbitrary separations from those to whom he has formed an attachment, like the beloved grandmother who's always standing in for the mother figure. Separations that disclose, in turn, the essential separateness of all individuals. The realization of the path beyond time, offered to him by his involuntary memories, is followed swiftly by a revelation about time's implacable effects on himself and those around him. And Gunninga was still talking about this sense that regaining time is always sort of a sense predicated on having lost it. So we always see the way in which these involuntary memories are followed by this sort of more negative afterglow, perhaps the wrong word, about time's sort of implacable nature, the effects of time which are neither predictable nor easily translated into meaning or aesthetic design. He's discovered the boons of recovered memory, but he never reaches the same assurance in relation to the linear time that seems only to deplete. So what I'm trying to do in this short talk is to think about time and contingency in Proust in relation to the representation of old age, a theme famously prominent in the closing scenes of the novel, but actually relatively little discussed. And perhaps we're starting in our little mini Proust seminar that we're having now. Maybe we're starting to put that right. But I think I'm right in saying it's relatively little discussed in criticism in its own right. And as a frame, I'm going to briefly reread Proust's novel in relation to a neglected essay by Roland Barthes, Barthes' idiosyncratic 1965 preface to Chateaubriand's 1844 work of hagiography, The Life of Rancé, it's nice we've had a bit of mention of Chateaubriand already, which takes as its governing concern, Barthes' preface, the writing of old age as both theme and aesthetic. Chateaubriand's work is a biography of the abbot Rancé, who retired into religious seclusion at the end of his life and was said to have founded the Trappist order of monks. And apparently, I don't think he did, but Barthes kind of goes along with that story. It's not quite like that, but anyway. And this work, this biography, has threaded through it Chateaubriand's parenthetical remarks about old age, and Barthes sort of seizes on these in his preface. And Chateaubriand's often talking about himself in these slightly odd, kind of fragmentary comments. Proust is not explicitly named in Barthes' preface, but he is, I think, as Malcolm Bowie saw him being throughout Barthes' work, a tantalising presence. Barthes writes of old age that it can be a disease like love. Chateaubriand, Barthes writes, made a sickness of his old age. In him, old age has a consistency of its own. It exists as a foreign body, awkward, painful, and the old man sustains magical relations with it. And this feels, I think, uncannily like Proust's description of the illness of his aging grandmother in the Guermantes way, which prompts him to observe that in such illness we encounter a being from a different realm, worlds apart from us, with no knowledge of us, and by whom it is impossible to make ourselves understood, our body. Our own form becomes a foreign body in old age, and even as we live it, as Barthes suggests of Chateaubriand, this period is a paradoxical experience which language can never reach. The aging woman in Chateaubriand's text is similarly a nighttime traveller in the period of old age, no longer able to see the earth, but only the sky. Rancé, as an old man, travels in the region of pure silence. These depictions of old age are reminiscent of what Barthes later calls Proust's inversions, kind of stylistic, metaphorical inversions. The most dominant, the complete inversion of day and night, perhaps. Barthes suggests this might be the real inversion Proust effected. It's a stylistic pattern closely connected to the way in which the whole novel seems to take place in the twilight world of bed and half sleep. Barthes' suggestion in the preface that adolescence and old age are alike in feeling to the subject like a period of abandonment is also given an oblique reprise through the ghost of Proust's famous opening line. For a long time I used to go to bed early. In the quotation Barthes makes of Madame de Rambouillet on growing old, for a long time now she had no longer existed, barring the days which bore. An adolescent fear of extinction, of the darkness swallowing one up, found at the beginning of À la Recherche. The ray of light that was under his door had disappeared. Is mirrored, Barthes suggests, in the existential crisis of getting old, having seclusion forced upon you, and a final darkness opening up ahead of you. Later in his writing career, Barthes responds to the threat of extinction in old age with a manifesto, quoting Proust's enjoinment to work while you still have the light. The Rancé preface, however, is more ambivalent about old age and how literature might serve it. Barthes' 1965 preface foreshadows the more sustained reflection on ageing in his work in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when, despite only being in his early 60s at the time and not unwell, he starts to think of his own life in terms of its end. And the moment when, as he puts it in his seminar at the Collège de France in December 1978, he begins to realise that his days are numbered and death is real. He was, of course, to die suddenly and accidentally just a year later, giving these remarks, and it's kind of a cliche, but it's also true, giving these kind of remarks an added bite. He determines at this moment to turn from criticism to fiction. The art structuralist will from now on take subjectivity as a principle, and Proust's vast excavation of the self as his model. Barthes never writes the projected novel, perhaps because of his untimely death, but we're left with his notes for it, this lecture course at the Collège de France. In the session of March the 10th, 1979, he introduces the idea of a moment of truth in Proust's work, exemplified in the touching details given about the grandmother in Proust's novel, a textual moment that goes to the root of the concrete, as Barthes calls it, and in giving such a vivid image of mortal life, designates what will die. Proust passes on to Barthes, as the latter puts it, the problem of the truth of affect, related to, if not identical with, the quiddity of things in such moments. These moments are not explicitly or necessarily depictions of old age, but the two key examples that Barthes gives, the death of old Prince Bolkonsky in War and Peace and the death of Marcel's grandmother, are constitutively framed as encounters not only with the end of life, but also advanced ageing. The grandmother's disordered grey locks, or brown and wrinkled cheeks, are the touchstones for Barthes' own turn towards subjectivity as theme and affect as stylistic end. This is a turn occasioned, of course, by a bereavement, a response in which he also styles himself after Proust, both embarking on their great works of fiction after the loss of their beloved mothers, and both realising in the wake of these losses, what Barthes calls pain's onset, that their own deaths were at once contingent, Barthes says, for who could calculate it in advance, and necessary. Old age, Barthes realises, must not be a running aground, a slow entrenchment in the quicksand. One must enter death alive. The loss of the mother, reconceived, of course, as the grandmother in Proust's novel, while touching in both cases, is very much in the vein of that talked about by Marlene, I think, yesterday, the loss of the repository for the writer's coherent narrative self. When the narrator remembers his dead grandmother involuntarily, feeling her to be palpably present again, a memory of the body rather than the mind, the happiness at re-encountering her is nonetheless traversed by the certainty, springing up like a repeated physical pain, of a nothingness that erased my image of that tenderness, which had destroyed that existence, abolished retrospectively our mutual predestination. Time can hold within it the capacity to restore lost time, past memory, but it can also rip away the objects of our attachment and consequently damage our image of ourselves. He finds his grandmother again as if in a mirror, but she is a mirage, lost to him ultimately, and the image of himself that her adoring gaze has offered back to him is also erased. He observes that she is simply someone whom chance has led to spend a few years with me, as it might have been with anyone at all, but for whom, before and after, I was nothing, would be nothing. Time can, in Proust's, I love this phrase, not everyone loves it, but time can, in Proust's lovely phrase attached to this realization, abolish retrospectively our mutual predestination. We personify our good as well as our bad luck, the source of our happiness as well as our suffering. And it's as disturbing to realize that our past good luck has been accidental and without meaning beyond our personal narrative, as it is to be aware that future suffering is also an entirely arbitrary matter. Furthermore, the episodes of involuntary memory are in this sense infiltrated by the linear passage of time. I'm always reminded of Margaret Gillette's brilliant observation that when we read a literary fiction, the characters are always or almost always getting older, however minimally. So the linear passage of time, or Proust's aesthetic, is championed as a way to abolish time, to restore the past, to produce an enduring image for it. And this aesthetic is built on these episodes of involuntary memory. But as we've said, these episodes are, in fact, freighted with loss. Aging, then, threatens to unseat Proust's aesthetic scheme and psychological credo. Its grinding linearity menaces the serendipity of the chance encounters that restore his past to him, showing that past utterly changed in the present. This truth delivers to him a truer version of his grandmother, however, even in affronting and so bringing to light the egotistical basis of his investment in her. There's something touching in the recognition of her independent subjectivity, someone who has simply been led by chance to spend a few years with the narrator. The nihilistic hyperbole notwithstanding, I think there's still buried in there something that is quite touching in the recognition of her separateness. It's an apprehension of life and other lives beyond the trajectory of one's own concerns that this experience of time and age, this moment of truth, brings with it, not just an apprehension of death. Thank you.